Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is good news. As the headlines read at the bottom there, an extraordinary summit of the SADC heads of state and government on Zimbabwe is scheduled to take place in Salaam, Tanzania on October the 31st, 2023, to discuss the Zimbabwe election crisis. This is a piece of good news. Initially, when we started with the election, some of us feared that the SADC and AU election observers will do the usual thing, come round, look around, and come up with, the elections were substantially free, fair, and credible. And thus rubber stamp the result, and Zanu PF retains its legitimacy. I think Zanu PF also expected the same thing, because this happened in 2013 and 2018. Many people were surprised when the SADC and the AU election observers completely made a U-turn and started looking at the process itself, and they condemned it. Zanu PF, of all people, were probably the most surprised, shocked, couldn't believe it. And with typical Zanu PF style, their reaction was, if you can't address the message, attack the messenger. And so the election observer team was subjected to some of the undiplomatic abuse that has ever happened. And they thought they would scare everybody into submission. When the election observer team report finally came out last week, they were the first ones off the line to dismiss it as this is the final chapter in these elections. We've seen the report. Okay, now let's move on. And some of us said, well, wait. The report is out. The heads of state and government have to come to read it and to say what they think. No, we're told. This is it. This is the final thing. Forget it. It's over. Let's move on. And now we are being told that no. The heads of state, in this case actually, they would have read the report and agreed that there was need for an extraordinary summit to discuss it. The very fact that they've agreed to a summit to discuss it clearly shows that they have refused to have that report swept under the carpet, which in my view is a very positive thing. Very positive. The gentleman we're seeing there in the picture is the acting Zimbabwe Minister of Foreign Affairs. And on Friday, he apparently met up with all the diplomats from the SADC countries to discuss the report and to assure them that Zimbabwe was going to study the report and give its own reaction. He was reportedly talking about how Zimbabwe respects SADC, and it's grateful for the report, and they're taking it very seriously, etc., etc. It's ironic that he is now talking of the respecting SADC institutions, and yet when the report first came out, the head of the SADC election observer team, Dr. Neves Mumba of Zambia, and the Zambian president himself were called puppets, and all kind of other abusive language, completely over the top. I think it was meant to intimidate everybody in SADC into submission. Some of the Zanu PF apologists talked of, we are SADC. SADC is nothing without us. And if SADC doesn't do what we want, we'll leave SADC. I think they've come to their senses and realized that Zimbabwe cannot keep on isolating itself. Mugabe took Zimbabwe out of the Commonwealth following a similar problem, failing to implement, to hold free, fair, and credible elections. And when it became clear that the Commonwealth were going to ask Zimbabwe to walk out, Mugabe preempted that by announcing that Zimbabwe was leaving the Commonwealth. In other words, we were not pushed, we jumped. But it doesn't matter. The end result is still the same. We are no longer in the SADC, in the Commonwealth. And the prospects of Zimbabwe doing the same thing with SADC was real. But I think even this regime realized that that wasn't really a meaningful option. Because the African Union had an observer team too, and they came to the same conclusion, that the Zimbabwe elections were not free, fair, and credible. That was the reality. The facts on the ground supported all that. So if SADC is going to stand up to Zanu PF and tell them, we're not going to grant you political legitimacy, if Zanu PF is going to carry out his threat and walk out, I think we'll be looking at Zanu PF will have to walk out of the African Union too. Because I don't see how the African Union is going to ignore their own African Union election report that came to the same conclusion as we are seeing here. This is the SADC conclusion, probably the most important bit of it. Section 13.3. And it says, the SADC election observer mission noted that, as detailed in sections 6 and 7 of this report, some aspects of the harmonized elections fell short of the requirements of the Constitution of Zimbabwe, the Electoral Act, and SADC's principles and guidelines governing democratic elections. It could not be any more explicit. The regime have tried to find loopholes and say, oh, it's only some aspects. But actually, if you go to section 6 and 7, the details they gave in those sections. Take, for instance, on the issue of the failure to produce a verified voters roll. The kind of errors you've been able to uncover, rather, but were uncovered by Tim Pachedu, where you find people who had been in the voters roll suddenly find they're no longer on the voters roll, and those who are still on the voters roll, their names have been changed from one ward to another, and sometimes from one ward to a different constituency. They never asked to be moved. So why were they being moved? And this is not just isolated cases. This is widespread. To turn around and say such a flawed voters roll could produce legitimate result is an outrage. And I'm really thrilled that the SADC heads of state and government have themselves come to the same conclusion, that this process was so flawed and so illegal, it could not possibly produce a legitimate result. And those Zanu PF apologists and propagandists who tried to convince the rest of the country, that this report is just nothing, forget it, let's move on, have had to eat humble pie. SADC is clearly saying, no, this is important. We are going to have that extraordinary summit to discuss nothing but the election. And I'm glad they're doing that. We cannot carry on with this madness where we keep having a situation where we go through an election process. And the process is so flawed, so illegal, that we already know the result before the result are even announced. It's ridiculous. 43 years after independence, in this day and age, we can't run free, fair, and credible elections. Not for somebody else, for ourselves. Zimbabweans have never had free, fair, and credible elections. And this is one of the, if not the number one issue we fought for in the fight for independence. And yet, we are nowhere near it. I am absolutely thrilled that SADC election observers disregarded everything, disregarded the history, and looked at the process and said this process is flawed, and produced their report to say that. And SADC heads of state have refused to be bullied into ignoring the report and say, no, we want to discuss that report. And I hope the next thing will be Zanu PF is not legitimate. Zanu PF and their sidekick, Triple C, are not legitimate. Then, and only then, can we start seriously looking into the problem of what are we going to do about it. And I hope who will have the courage to finally appoint a transition arrangement that will address this fundamental problem. The last one, the GNU of 2008 to 2013, failed to implement even one token democratic reform to ensure that the elections were free, fair, and credible. Let's hope the transition authority that will be appointed this time will be up to the task. I am absolutely thrilled that SADC have come to a very honorable decision not to sweep the report of their own election observer team. And let's remind ourselves that this report was not written by Dr. Mumba alone. I take it, other than Zimbabwe itself, which was the country that is being observed, all the other SADC countries had a member on that team. And this was a consensus decision that the process was flawed. And I hope this is not the first time we're going to see this. This is going to be the norm from now on. We're sending out a clear signal that in SADC, we want free, fair, and credible elections. And any country, any government that fails to deliver on that will be held to account. Zimbabwe has failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections before in 2008. This is a repeat. We need to deal with it now. And I hope this time, instead of SADC taking the responsibility of what kind of solution are we going to have, they're going to invite other institutions like the UN to play a role. SADC last time, I believe, they must have known that Zanu PF, to start with, would not want to implement any meaningful reforms. And secondly, the opposition on whose shoulder the responsibility of implementing the reforms will lie are corrupt and incompetent. If they didn't know that, they know it now. The reason why MDC failed to implement even one meaningful reform during the GNU was because the MDC leaders were corrupt and incompetent. We cannot pretend we don't know that. We know that. And the facts, the historic facts on the ground confirms it. During the GNU itself, when Zanu PF cronies were asked, why is MDC not implementing the reforms? They would boast, Mazwana MDC Kanyere. They will never rock the boat. SADC diplomats themselves were well aware of that. One of them was quoted by the Independent paper soon after the 2013 elections. And he told the reporter that MDC were in the GNU to enjoy themselves. And they forgot why they were there. SADC, at least by the end of the GNU, the 2008 to 2013, they knew that our friends in MDC/CCC were corrupt and incompetent. And I think this is the challenge that we have got to face. If we want the reforms to be implemented, we have got to insist on competent people who will implement all the democratic reforms. Zimbabwe cannot afford to have another go at this problem and fail. We can't afford that. Zimbabwe is a failed state. Our economy is in tatters. On the social media, there's been reports of a young musician who was involved in an accident in Masvingo. He was taken to Masvingo General Hospital, and they found there was no scanners were working, no oxygen, there was no ambulances, no medication, and the young man lingered on for 12 hours before he finally passed away without any appropriate medical attention. Masvingo General Hospital is the provincial referral hospital. If it doesn't have any of those, what more of the smaller hospitals, Ndanga, Chivi, and so forth? Nothing. They will have nothing. This is an indication of a failed state. And that situation is not only pertaining to Masvingo. We can be rest assured that at least all the other remaining 7 provincial hospitals will probably be in a similar state, other than Harare and Bulawayo. All the other ones will be in the same pathetic situation. And this is a country that has got so much wealth. During this last election, the one we're talking about right now, many people believe Zanu PF would have probably have spent at least $5 billion in bribes. They were buying chicken in for ordinary povo with drinks at all the rallies, ferrying them from one rally to another. That costs money. And the higher you go, the bigger the bribe. And those at the top, the judges. 2 weeks before nomination day, they were each given a housing allowance of $400,000. They've got houses already. They've got cars already. Of course, everybody knows what that means, housing allowance. On paper, it says they're supposed to repay it, but in reality, they never have to repay it. And if they got it as cash, they could use it for something else. If they got it as a building, they could sell it. This is what we're talking about here. Zimbabwe cannot afford this wastage of the country's human and material resources. Criminal. We can't afford it. I therefore totally applaud the SADC, heads of state and government, for doing the honorable thing upholding the SADC Election Observer Team's report that reported on the situation pertaining in Zimbabwe regarding elections. We don't even have something as mundane as a verified voters roll. How can we have free, fair, and credible elections without something as simple as that? I absolutely am thrilled. I cannot hide my joy. Like I said, this is not normal. In Zimbabwe, the normal thing would have been for SADC in the AU to see nothing, hear nothing, and say nothing. And at the end of the day, come with a report saying the election process was substantially free, fair, and credible. And Zanu PF gets its political approval, legitimacy. This has not happened this time. And that is great news. Absolutely great news. We now have to wait for the 31st of October to see what the regional body decides. But the very fact that they have decided they will have that extraordinary summit clearly, to me, says we are taking this seriously. And so they should. Thank you very much for listening. And I think I will conclude there tonight. So watch this space. Let's see what SADC heads of state and government are going to say and on the 31st of October. It's not far to go now. 15 days, about 2 weeks. We've waited 43 years. We can wait 15 days. But this is really thrilling news. Thank you very much again, and good night to everybody.